Good afternoon. In this lecture and in the next, we will mentally travel to faraway places. Because we will deal with the conquest of Northern Africa. A long struggle for the control of Northern Africa during the second half of the 7th century. It was a conflict between three different civilizations: the Byzantine Empire, the Caliphate, and the Berber monarchs. It was a very important historical process for the extension of the territories concerned and for its lasting consequences, very relevant also for Europe. In order to understand this conflict, we need to know the three antagonists. We have dealt with the Byzantine Empire and the Caliphate in previous lectures. This time, I will begin with the Berbers. In lecture 13, I had already started to give an idea of the ancient province of Africa. Once a prosperous region of the Roman Empire. Through its port of Carthage, the province had been a great exporter of olive oil, wheat, wine, and pottery. Those goods were sent especially to Italy, just on the other side of the Strait of Sicily. The province was not only significant from an economic point of view, it had been home of some of the greatest intellectuals of the Roman Empire, like Apuleius, Tertullian, and Augustine. The Arabs will call this region Ifriqiya. It covered roughly the territories from the coast west of the Gulf of Sirte up to eastern Algeria. West of the province of Africa were the ancient Roman provinces of Numidia and Mauritania, which the Arabs will call the Maghreb, that is, the West. Also in those regions there was a certain presence of Byzantine forces, but more sporadic. In the 7th century, only few Byzantine outposts survived west of modern Tunisia, isolated and distant from each other. The province of Africa had gone through a long decadence, culminated with the invasion of the Vandals, who had come from Spain 200 years before. In the 6th century, the Byzantines had retaken the province of Africa after a century of Vandal rule, but they had not been able to restore the economic ties with Italy, now mostly in the hands of another Germanic people, hostile to the Roman Empire, the Lombards. Left without its main market for agricultural production, many of the province's cultivated lands had been consigned to semi-nomadic husbandry. Many villages had been abandoned, and once populous cities had regressed to simple villages, while the surrounding territories had largely returned under the Berber control. The Latin language was less and less spoken, and in some areas even Christianism had been replaced by the Berbers' traditional religion. The word of the ancient Berbers is elusive for us because they did not leave any written records. Who were they? The word Berbers was used for the first time by the Arabs, who had borrowed a Greek word used by the Byzantines. In antiquity, The inhabitants of Mauritania had been called Mauri by the ancient Romans and Mauroi by the ancient Greeks. Then, about 1 century before the Arab conquest, Procopius, who wrote about the long war that the Byzantines fought against local tribes after getting rid of the Vandals, called the people of those tribes Mauroi Barbaroi to distinguish them from the local people who accepted the Byzantine domination, hence the word Berber. As mentioned, the ancient Romans named the inhabitants of northern Africa differently, depending on the regions where they lived. West of Carthage lived the Numidians. West of the Numidians and up to the Atlantic coast lived the Mauri. South of Numidia and Mauritania, in the harsh environment bordering the Sahara, lived the Getuli, a warlike people who practiced horse rearing. They sold to the Romans the wild beasts employed for public entertainment, and they sold the murex, the precious shellfish needed for the purple dye. The murex was found on the Atlantic coast of what is now southern Morocco. East of the Getuli, in today's Libya, lived the Gramantes. They were farmers and traders, and traded with the Roman in wheat, salt, and slaves, in exchange for the olive oil and the wine of the province of Africa. The Gramantes had built a few cities and had developed an elaborate underground irrigation system. These are examples of peoples who spoke similar languages, languages belonging to the family of the Berber languages. This family is, in turn, part of a much larger macrofamily, that of the Afro-Asiatic languages, which also includes the Semitic languages, ancient Egyptian, and dozens of other languages spoken from the Horn of Africa to northern Nigeria. Today, some 30 million people still speak Berber languages. They are distributed in a huge area that includes Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on. Also, the origins of the ancient Berber religion are lost in the mists of time. We know that there were a few variants of it, predating that of the Olympian gods of the ancient Romans, and even the religion of the Phoenicians. We know very little about the Berbers' beliefs, which might have been influenced by the religions of Black Africa, but we know that they survived in remote locations for many centuries after the Islamic conquest, and that they disappeared completely only about 300 years ago. But let's go back to the Berber languages. Why did ancient languages of Northwest Africa belong to the same macrofamily of the Semitic languages, originally spoken in places as far as Mesopotamia? The cause of these linguistic similarities is much more ancient than the Arab conquest, of course, and even much more ancient than the foundation of Carthage by the Phoenicians. Was there another, much older migration from the Middle East to Northern Africa? Ancient authors gave us a faint echo of such a migration, shrouded in mythology. For instance, Herodotus, who wrote in the 5th century before Christ, reported about a people of Libyan farmers, the Massi, who claimed that they descended from the Trojans. He mentioned this only briefly in the 3rd book of his histories, beside even more fantastic stories about the peoples of northern Africa, like that of the famous lotus eaters that appear in the Odyssey, or that of people with dog heads, and that of people with no heads and eyes on their chests. However, a few centuries later, in the 1st century BC, the Roman historian Sallust also mentioned the belief in a very ancient migration clouded in mythology. In his monographic work Bellum Jugurthinum, an account of the war against the Numidian prince Jugurtha, Sallust makes reference to a legend, probably of Carthaginian origin, that Numidians and Maori descended from Median, Persian, and Armenian troops who had followed the Greek demigod Heracles to Spain. When he died there, Heracles died there, those people moved to northern Africa and colonized it. By the way, the Carthaginians had regarded local African peoples as profoundly different from themselves and had never integrated them into their state, as the Romans did with other Italic peoples. According to another historian who wrote 7 centuries after Sallust, Procopius, the Maori were the descendants of people from the land of Canaan, who had escaped the Jewish tribes led by Joshua after they left Egypt. These different myths about a Middle Eastern origin of the Berbers seem to hint at something too ancient to have generated a shared narrative. Something occurred much earlier than those ancient authors could conceive. The Afroasiatic dispersion might have taken place 10,000 years before Christ. But I digress. In any case, the word of the Berbers at the end of the late antiquity had the extension of a continent. It stretched from the Nile Valley to the Canary Islands and from the Mediterranean coast to the Niger River, below which, at the time of the Arab conquest, was the Ghana Empire, the fabulous land of gold. In these almost boundless spaces, including the planet's largest desert, chains of mountains, vast highlands and plains, the Berbers were, depending on the place, nomads, shepherds, or farmers. Their tribal and conservative society was proud of their ancient customs. They had seen the rise and the fall or the decline of many peoples, the Carthaginians, the ancient Romans, the Vandals, and the Byzantines, all coming from overseas, all bringing their wars and their fearsome gods with them, all hungry of fertile lands and of tributes to finance their lavish cities. Of all those civilizations, not much had been left in Africa in the 7th century. Neither their languages, nor their institutions, nor the economic prosperity, nor the cultural fabric of those societies, except for Christianity, by then also in decline. Even the last ones to come to Africa, the Byzantines, seemed to be on the retreat by then. They had not really resisted the Arab incursions. The only one who had put up a decent fight had been the Exarch Gregory, who wanted to make of Africa his own personal empire. But he had failed, and what had been left to the Berbers of the region's great past? Firstly, they had preserved their linguistic and religious heritage through 2 millennia of foreign domination. Another strength of the Berber was the extension of their territories, comprising deserts and wild mountains in which it was easy to hide and fight back against invaders. The third asset of the Berbers was their number, mainly due to the demographic growth that had characterized the first 3 centuries of the Roman domination. In addition, like all people practicing pastoralism, and especially the peoples living in semi-arid areas, the Berber were used to fighting. And finally, they had been known for centuries as the best horsemen of the West. All those factors made of the Berbers formidable foes of the Caliphate. In lesson 13, we had seen the first expedition of the Arabs west of Egypt, that of Amr bin al-As in 642. From Alexandria, Amr reached Tripoli and managed to take it, but then he returned to Egypt. This expedition had not been a conquest, apart from for the region of Cyrenaica, which had passed durably under Arab control. There, in the city of Barca, an ancient Greek colony, Amr had appointed his nephew, Uqba bin Nafi, governor of the area. We will talk about him in a couple of minutes. After this incursion, Amr had been removed from his position of governor of Egypt by Caliph Uthman, who replaced him with his own foster brother, Abdullah bin Sa'd bin Abi Sarh. In 647, Abdullah undertook a second military expedition to the province of Africa, where, in the meantime, the Byzantine Exarch Gregory had proclaimed his independence from Constantinople. He had moved the capital of the province from Carthage to Sufetula, today's Beitla, in the center of present Tunisia. There, just outside the city, a great battle with the Arabs took place, in which Gregory was defeated and killed. The Arabs returned with an immense booty, but also the second incursion had not resulted in a conquest, and the Byzantine regained the control of the province. After the second incursion, the Arab conquest of Africa stopped for about 2 decades. In the next decades, the Arab war effort focused on the creation of a fleet. Abdullah bin Sa'd was in fact the commander who won the sea battle of Finike in 655. And shortly after this success, a protest erupted in the Caliphate, resulted in a civil war that prevented further expeditions to northern Africa. Only in 670, Caliph Muawiyah endorsed the authority of the ambitious Uqba on Ifriqiya. Uqba dreamed of great conquests, worthy of those of his uncle Amr, who had conquered Egypt, and had in the meantime regained his position of governor of Egypt, which Amr held until 664, the year of his death. Uqba's prestige was reinforced by the fact that he had known the Prophet when he was still a child, and he had followed Amr in his expedition that had reached Tripoli almost 30 years before, and had personally led raids to the remote oases of Zuila and Adamis. When in 670 Muawiyah confirmed Uqba's position, he who lived in the memory of those glorious days decided to return to the province of Africa and conquer it for Islam. He immediately gathered some 10,000 Arab cavalry troops in Egypt, as well as some Berbers of Cyrenaica converted to Islam, and led them to what is now central Tunisia. From there he moved northwards, conquering many villages and obtaining conversions the Arab way, probably. When he realized that the conversions were only superficial and dictated by fear, he felt that the local population could not be trusted. Therefore, also in Ifriqiya, as in other regions recently conquered, the Muslim army would not mix up with the locals in any existing city, but create a new city for themselves, isolated and easily defendable. In a wooded location, at a day's distance from the east coast of Tunisia, near to the ruins of an ancient Roman fort, Uqba founded another of those garrison cities of the Caliphate. It was the most basic place imaginable, a mosque built of clay and huts made with the canes of a nearby swamp. It was called, with a word borrowed from the Persian language, Al-Qayrawan, meaning military encampment. It would become the Tunisian city of Qayrawan. However, in the Caliphate hierarchy, Uqba reported to the governor of Egypt, not directly to the Caliph. And in 675, the governor of Egypt decided to put someone else in charge for Ifriqiya, a former freed slave, probably an Egyptian, in spite of his Arab name, Abu al-Muhajir. The new governor of Ifriqiya arrived at Al-Qayrawan with his troops, and the handover was not smooth. Uqba was sent in chains to Damascus, where the Caliph ordered his release. We do not know what happened between the two men, and we do not know the causes for the removal of Uqba. Certainly, the two men had opposite personalities and backgrounds. Uqba belonged to the aristocracy of the Caliphate, had a huge sense of entitlement, and was thirsty for glory, impulsive, and a risk-taker. Abu al-Muhajir had raised himself from a very humble condition, was a prudent man, a planner, and an excellent diplomat. Their lines of action would also be diametrically opposed, as we will see. Anyway, while he was traveling in chains toward Damascus, Uqba swore that he would one day repay Abu al-Muhajir with the same treatment. In the meanwhile, the new governor of Ifriqiya had settled down outside of Al-Qayrawan as if to mark the discontinuity with his predecessor. He adopted a completely different policy towards the African people and worked hard to establish an alliance with the strongest chief of the Berbers, who ruled over a kingdom that covered a large area between Algeria and Morocco. The information we have about this king is scarce and dating from many years after his death. He was born and lived in Tlemcen, a city of western Algeria, nearly at the border of Morocco, on the mountains that run parallel to the Algerian coast. He was known by the Latin name of Cecilius or Cecilius, or with the Berber name of Axil, which means leopard. Phonetically, these two names were similar. Therefore, it is possible that the Berber version was an adaptation of the Latin one. As it seems, he was a Christian, and his Latin name could in fact imply that he had been baptized. The Arabs knew him as Qusayla, and I will use this name in this lesson. Certainly, many of his subjects were Christians, and Qusayla maintained good relationship with the Byzantines, who kept some troops in a few outposts on the North African coast, west of Carthage, very far from each other and surrounded by Berber territories. Anyway, after an intense diplomatic activity, Abu al-Muhajir met Qusayla and established with him an alliance. He converted him to Islam, and even persuaded him to move to the distant Al-Qayrawan. It was a phenomenal diplomatic success. This anti-Byzantine coalition seemed the harbinger of the final conquest of Africa. And in fact, in 678, Abu al-Muhajir was making preparations for a siege of Carthage. The city did not fall, but the Arabs gained a considerable booty, and the Byzantines lost the control of the city hinterland. At this point, however, something occurred that changed everything again. In 680, Caliph Muawiyah died and was succeeded by his son Yazid, who reintegrated Uqba in his role of governor of Ifriqiya. Uqba rushed to Al-Qayrawan and arrested Abu al-Muhajir. Then he showed again his hard and uncompromising attitude towards the Berbers. He humiliated King Kusila by requesting him to slaughter a male sheep in public, and after perceiving that he was outraged, placed him in chains. Uqba was determined to carry out his grandiose plans of conquest before other political changes could upset them again. He left Al-Qayrawan to his son with the bulk of the troops and headed westwards with a small group of warriors. Along the route that passed south of the Ores Mountains, taking with him his two prisoners in chains until Kusila managed to escape. Always moving westwards, Uqba defeated several contingents of Berbers and Byzantine troops and arrived in what is now Morocco. Then he moved north and reached Tangier, an ancient city, probably were governed by a certain Julian, who was probably a Byzantine commander or former commander, whom the immense distance from Constantinople had granted independence. We will mention him in other lectures because he will play a role in the history of the Arab conquest. In order to get rid of Uqba, Julian dissuaded him from crossing the strait, which was immediately north of Tangier, and convinced him to advance in direction southwest towards the Atlantic coast. Just south of Tangier was Walili, the ancient volubilis of the Romans, near what is today the city of Meknes. The Roman Empire had practically forsaken this city, conquered by the Berbers already in the 3rd century, as it was too far for being defended. Yet, still in the 7th century, a Christian Latin-speaking community lived there, as we know from the inscription of the tombs that were found amid the city ruins. Incidentally, when speaking about the Neo-Latin languages, people normally forget that there was also a Romance language in Africa, spoken for centuries in some communities spread between Morocco and Tunisia. Anyway, Uqba conquered Walili and then moved in direction southwest through the coastal plains of Morocco. After covering hundreds of miles in unknown territories, he crossed the Atlas chain and reached the Draa River, almost 1,000 kilometers southwest of the strait. At this point, he turned back and crossed the Atlas Mountains again, always clashing occasionally with the Berber populations in the Souss region. Uqba was by then in territories that had never been part of the Roman Empire and that will continue for a long time to be the limit of the Arab expansion in Africa. We can only try to imagine the state of mind of Uqba and his men. Only 2 years before, Uqba was stuck in Damascus, regretting the lost opportunity for fame, and now he was leading his men through landscapes that no Arab had ever seen or heard of before. Over 4,000 kilometers from the Caliphate's capital, often fighting his way through as if pushed by a supernatural force, rushing forward every day towards the end of the world. Eventually, he reached the Atlantic, not far from where today is the city of Agadir. He thrust into the sea on his horse and exclaimed, "Oh Lord, if the sea did not stop me, I would continue to cross the lands like Alexander the Great to defend your faith and fight the infidels." The image of Uqba on his horse with the water of the Atlantic Ocean reaching to his chest became the icon of the Arab conquest, and Uqba became a symbol of them as he had always dreamed. Today, the main mosque of Kairouan still bears the name of Uqba, a personalization uncommon in the Muslim world. However, in the pursuit of glory, Uqba obviously lacked the men that could hold the towns and villages he had conquered. In fact, his army kept decreasing because of people dead or sent back with booty. For instance, Uqba captured several Berber girls of extraordinary beauty and sent them to Syria to the delight of the Caliphate's elite. One of them will later become the mother of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur. Uqba also opened a few mosques here and there, but his expedition in the Maghreb had not been a conquest. Eventually, he set himself on the long way back to Al-Qayrawan, but this time his past was about to catch up with him. As said, not long after the start of Uqba's expedition to the Maghreb, the Berber king Kusila had managed to escape. He had regained immediately the support of his people and had approached the Byzantines, always ready to take favorable opportunities. He waited for Uqba to return, and in 682, or perhaps 683, he intercepted him on his way back, south of the Ores Mountains near Biskra. Kusila had gathered an army which also included Byzantine troops. As it seems, Uqba had only a few hundred men with him then, as the others had preceded him to Al-Qayrawan. There could have been no doubt about the outcome of the battle. The story goes that before the battle, Uqba, who still had Abu al-Muhajir in chains with him, heard him reciting a few verses expressing sorrow because he could not reach for his weapons. He ordered his men to release Abu al-Muhajir and invited him to leave as he had no duty to fight. The other replied that his only wish was to take up arms together with the Muslims. Then the two former enemies drew their swords and broke the scabbards that were useless by then. And so did all the others before fighting side by side and falling in the ensuing battle. After this victory, Kusila returned to Al-Qayrawan and occupied it, while the Arabs returned to their distant stronghold of Barca in Cyrenaica, which a desert separated from Ifriqiya. Uqba's race to the ends of the world had resulted in a crushing defeat, which brought the Arabs back to the situation of 40 years before they set foot in the territories west of Cyrenaica. And the recovery was not in sight in view of the latest developments in the Caliphate. As said, in 680 Muawiyah had been succeeded by his son Yazid. This essentially dynastic succession had not been accepted by a few important figures of the Caliphate. One of them had been the son of Ali, Hussein, but as we have seen in lecture 15, Hussein was drawn into a trap and killed with most of his supporters. Another important figure who objected to the legitimacy of Yazid's caliphate was Abdullah bin Zubayr, perhaps the most illustrious exponent of the Meccan aristocracy. You may remember that Abu Bakr, the first caliph, was the father of one of the Prophet's wives, Aisha. Well, Abdullah was the son of a sister of Aisha. In other words, the Prophet was his uncle. In addition, Abdullah had been the first Muslim to be born in Medina after the Hijrah. Such things were of enormous importance in the Caliphate. It seems that on his deathbed, Muawiyah had recommended to Yazid to treat Hussein with honor and respect, but to deal quickly with Abdullah bin Zubayr, whom Muawiyah regarded as a threat for the Umayyad dynasty. During Muawiyah's rule, Abdullah bin Zubayr had abstained from political activities and had played his part in the military campaigns of the Caliphate, including the Battle of Sufaytullah, where he had played a prominent role, and including the naval offensive against Constantinople. However, when the news of the death of Hussein in Karbala reached him in Mecca, indignation took over. Abdullah spoke to the crowd, explaining how the presence of Hussein had been invoked by the people of Kufa, where Hussein had at first no intention to go, and how eventually none of those who had begged Hussein to go there had moved a finger to save him. At the end of his speech, the emotional crowd swore allegiance to Abdullah as the new caliph. After Mecca, also Medina, where Hussein still had many followers, sided with Abdullah. And other supporters of the new rebellion emerged in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the regions in which the protest against the Umayyad clan had erupted 25 years before. Thus, once more, there were two contenders for the caliphate. The civil war was back. In 683, Yazid sent a large military force to suffocate the rebellion. The army occupied Medina and subjected the city to a vicious looting. Then the Umayyad troops besieged Mecca and did not hesitate to target the Holy Kaaba with their catapults. However, they did not take the city because in that same year, Yazid died, probably in a riding accident. After a rule of only 3 years, he was succeeded by his son, Muawiyah bin Yazid, an adolescent, who reigned for only a couple of months before he died of illness. Meanwhile, the punitive expedition in Hijaz was aborted, and the influence of Abdullah bin Zubayr, considered by his followers the fifth rightly guided caliph, had extended to other areas in Arabia, Palestine, and even to the north of Syria. In the meantime, in Damascus, a new caliph had to be chosen. In 684, after long negotiations, the elderly but ambitious Marwan bin al-Hakam a cousin of Caliph Uthman who had served Muawiyah in Medina, became the new caliph. He achieved that by signing an agreement in force of which, upon his death, the caliphate would go to another grandson of Muawiyah, a younger brother of the recently deceased adolescent caliph, the mother of which, the widow of Yazid, Marwan, had just married. Marwan was an astute and capable leader. He succeeded in re-establishing the power of the Umayyads in most of the caliphate and in defeating the followers of Abdullah bin Zubayr in battle. However, also his reign was so short-lived, it lasted less than a year. In 685, Marwan died, perhaps murdered by his wife. The agreements he had signed had been rescinded, and Marwan had instead ensured the succession to one of his own sons, Abd al-Malik. In conclusion, after the long rule of Muawiyah, there had been in Damascus no less than 4 different caliphs in 6 years, without counting the rebel Caliph Abdullah al-Zubayr. After such a mess, Abd al-Malik prioritized the stabilization of the state. He signed a peace treaty with the Roman Empire, accepting an increase in the yearly tributes due by the Caliphate since the time of the failed assault to Constantinople. And also the conquest of Africa suffered a very long pause. Thus, after his victory in 683, Kusila ruled from Al-Qayrawan on Ifriqiya and the Maghrib, while the Byzantines maintained the control of Carthage and of a few coastal outposts, patrolling with their ships the long African coast. At last, Abd al-Malik managed to restore stability in the Caliphate. He reigned for 2 decades until 705. This continuity will make it possible to resume the conquest of Africa, whereby this will prove no easy task. The Caliphate will need to send many other armies to the region. In the next lesson, we will see the conclusion of this decades-long struggle between the Caliphate, the Byzantines, and the Berber leaders, among which a woman. For today, thank you for your interest and see you soon. A presto.